Irishmen that we see every spring. Patio furniture. You can share that with all your friends. You're welcome. It's my favorite joke. I'm Nicole Netherton. I'm the Executive Director of Travis Audubon, and we're very glad you've joined us tonight. If you're a member, thank you so much for supporting us and being part of our team. If you're not yet a member, please join us. You can go to the membership page on our website, which is travisaudubon.org. In addition to being St. Patrick's Day, it is Travis Audubon's birthday eve. We turned 70. We will turn 70 tomorrow, March 18th. And at our last meeting, I shared the typewritten minutes of the first meeting from 1952. And tonight I thought I would share another special artifact with you. This is the first Travis Audubon checklist for March of 1954. It was compiled by Ed Kutak and Fred Webster, you can see. And it also lists consultants that include Roy Bedachek and J. Frank Dobie. So it's a really cool historical artifact from our organization. It also cites records from 1925 as examples of sightings, which I thought was very cool and interesting. And then this is that checklist descendant, which we put out in 2019. This is the 65th anniversary checklist. So quite a legacy of birding and conservation that continues today. So happy birthday to us. If you've looked at our website lately, you'll know that we have lots of events lined up for this birthday, this coming week. There are still spots available if you want to join us. So if you go to our website, just click on the banner with the baby Golden-cheeked Warbler to learn more. Birdathon registration is also happening now, and Birding Brawl donations are open. So I hope you will sign up for one of our fabulous birding excursions. On our website, the whole month of April is packed with amazing opportunities to get out and bird. I'm looking for joiners for my Allendale Owls Birdathon. I'll plug my own since I have the floor. I'm hosting it with Janet Davis in Sheffield Park on April 20th. So you can find it on the website. I hope you'll come join us. And then finally, you're probably aware that lights out for spring migration has begun. I hope you will turn off your indoor and outdoor non-essential lights from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. and encourage your neighbors to do the same. We have yard signs available. If you'd like to put one in your yard, just email us if you would like one. So let's get started now. I thank you in advance for muting your microphone and turning off your camera. If you could enter any questions that you have for our speaker in the chat, we'll save them for the Q&A session at the end. And you can look for the recording of this meeting on our YouTube channel later this week. So it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Travis Audubon board member and ornithologist Rich Kostecki, who's here to introduce tonight's speaker. Hi, Rich.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Lisa O'Donnell. She's lived most of her life in the Austin area, and she's been involved in a lot of the issues that are near and dear to our hearts for quite some time. She started off as an endangered species biologist in 1987. She began working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1991. That's right when the Golden-cheeked Warbler was being listed as endangered. And she's since moved on and has a whole body of work with the city of Austin, and has just been intimately involved in all issues, Golden-cheeked Warbler, oak juniper woodland. And one of the things, one of the topics that's interest her, and I also find quite interesting, is you do hear these historic claims of what the hill country was like, and this idea that it was dominated by savanna, by grasslands, and even wild claims that juniper is not native, and so she very quickly started investigating this topic, and there's a lot of interesting historical material out there on that really kind of potentially changes the narrative of how we view these hill country habitats. So she's been compiling this information for several decades now, and she's going to be sharing some of that with us tonight. So I will hand things over to Lisa, and I'm sure this is going to be very interesting and enlightening. Thanks.
Thank you, Rich. And I'm going to turn off my video just so it's not distracting. We'll stay focused on the talk. And hopefully the slides will advance okay. So yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you for coming and listening to this talk. So my presentation's probably about as close as we can get to time travel, something I've always wanted to do. And so I think that's part of my fascination with this is it's an attempt to try to get at that. And we'll cover historic accounts and other documents of Texas Hill Country vegetation. We'll go as far back as the written records are available, which is the early 1700s, to get an idea of what the predominant vegetation communities were like prior to European settlement, and then how these vegetation communities have changed and how our perceptions of them have changed as well over the last 300 years. So normally when I give this talk, I focus on the relevance of historical ecology to present day land management. And for this presentation, I've put the emphasis on looking at how and why these perspectives have changed over time. To provide a segue, so kind of near the end, I'm going to pose a question and kind of a little bit of a call to action and a favor from you guys, which is going to be, can we improve the public's opinion of Ashe junipers? And doing this in large part to help facilitate conservation and recovery of the golden-cheeked warbler, and then all of the other species that depend on this native tree. Oh, and you are not advancing. Why is that? No, there it goes. All right, good. So, as Rich said, I started compiling these historic accounts of the hill country. It's been, I can't believe, almost 30 years ago. And as he said, I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service during the early 1990s, right after the listing of the golden-cheeked warbler as endangered. And it was during this time that I started hearing things like the hill country was originally dominated by grasslands, that became invaded by woodlands due to overgrazing and fire suppression, that Native Americans burned on a regular basis, and that Ashe juniper is not native and was brought in by the Spaniards. And to help illustrate just some of the prevalent beliefs about what the hill country looked like historically, the image on this slide shows a photograph that I took from a mural on a building that was just outside of Kerrville. And it says, area Indians annually burn the divide grasslands to provide fresh graze for antelope and buffalo. So it's not the first time I'd heard that Native Americans did the equivalent of prescribed burning, but I really wanted to see if I could find support for this in the historic accounts of the hill country. And then just note on there the 1865 date that was on that mural, and keep that in mind as we talk about just some of the historical events that were occurring during this time period. So here's another example of how prevalent the belief is that the hill country was originally grassland. This article uses historic accounts to justify land clearing practices, particularly of Ashe juniper. And you can see from the photos, there's some pretty drastic measures. We've got a big old chain and some fire and lots of clearing. And then this is just one quote out of this article, and it said, present day patterns of vegetation in the Texas hill country have shifted from rolling hills clothed with tall grasses. One of the most striking differences in the landscape is the large area that is now covered with dense cedar brakes, extensive stands of tall shrubs and trees dominated by Ashe juniper, commonly known as cedar. And before I forget, Ashe juniper and cedar are going to be used interchangeably here. It's the correct term is Ashe juniper. It's actually not a cedar, but yeah, we just commonly call it cedar. And then this article bases their claims on historic accounts, citing Frederick Law Olmsted from 1857. And then in addition to the quote that's shown on the slide, the article also states that when, and this is quote, when Frederick Law Olmsted crossed the Colorado River in 1857, he described the hill country region of central Texas as a vast region on which the live oak trees stand alone or in picturesque groups near and far upon the green sward, which rolls in long waves. The first settlers found a landscape covered with little timber other than ancient cypress trees and some scattered sturdy oaks growing upon a carpet of lush grasses and herbs. So we'll go to the source and see what Frederick Law Olmsted and others actually said about the Texas hill country vegetation. So as a land manager for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, I'm particularly interested in historic accounts for the Austin area. Since managing habitat for endangered and rare species really begins with an understanding of how, or at least I feel like it should anyway, begins with an understanding of how past events have shaped our present day ecosystems. And these are some of the endangered and rare species on our preserves. We have the Golden-cheeked Warbler, the black-capped Vireo, endangered and rare cave invertebrates. This is a little pseudoscorpion. We have aquatic salamanders. This is the Geological plateau salamander in the slide. Rare plants, the bracted twist flower is the purple flower with the bee hovering over it, and then the canyon mock orange, which is in the low right. And then all of these species depend on Ashe juniper oak ecosystems. As I mentioned, I started working on this project about 30 years ago. And to date, I've compiled accounts from over 20 observers, including missionaries, prospectors, settlers, scientists, and reporters. And the criteria for each of these historic accounts is that they must be firsthand primary accounts. So things like letters and diaries, reports, publications, things that were written by the observers soon after their experience. Memoirs tend to be problematic, less accurate as our secondhand accounts, so I did my best to exclude those. And my goal is just to give voice to these observers and allow them to speak for themselves. My role is to provide spatial and temporal context, including where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions, as well as timelines of major historical events, which I've divided into 4 different time periods that you see here on the slide. And then during the latter part of the 1800s, other sources of information like historic maps and photos, buildings and land grants become available to corroborate the written accounts. So wherever possible, we want to cross-reference and piece together information from different sources to provide this corroboration and validation, and just to make sure you've got as accurate a picture as possible. Historical ecology is much like piecing together a puzzle. Many pieces are necessary and should fit easily together. And it's important to look at multiple accounts and sources of information and look for common threads and consistency rather than focusing on or singling out like one particular account. This also includes information about endangered species habitat and distribution. So all of these are pieces of a puzzle that should fit together and collectively make sense. So just a brief mention of prehistoric records. While this has not been my focus, I do want to address the myth that Ashe juniper is not native. Fossilized juniper pollen has been identified in Friesenhahn Cave in northern Bexar County and dates back to the last ice age, which is about 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. So juniper's been in Texas for a really long time. And the fact that they even found juniper in this cave is quite extraordinary because juniper pollen is really tiny, it's very fragile, and it doesn't preserve well. So talking a little bit about spatial context. So it's really critical to determine where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions. And particularly with respect to the Balcones in our area anyway, the Balcones Fault or Balcones Escarpment, which is shown here as the black and white line, which separates the prairie region, which is shown in dark green, the Blackland Prairie, from the Edwards Plateau ecoregion, which is shown in at least my slide, it looks sort of light green. And then Austin, San Antonio, New Braunfels, and San Antonio were all settled on the prairie side near the base of the escarpment, and their respective counties lie along this major ecological divide that includes both the prairie and Edwards Plateau ecoregions, which support different plant and animal communities. So Travis County being a good example. So again, Austin, the main footprint of the town was settled on the Blackland Prairie side. So we have Blackland Prairie on the east, and then we have the Edwards Plateau ecoregion on the west. So when Frederick Law Olmsted reports seeing extensive grasslands, we need to know whether he was on the Blackland Prairie side or the Edwards Plateau side of the Balcones Escarpment. And for this project, we entered the locations of the historic accounts into a GIS database so that we could identify where these observers were. And then before I forget, the term hill country in this presentation refers to the hilly portions of primarily the eastern edge of the Edwards Plateau, but also includes a little bit of the Atlanta uplift and a little bit of the cross timbers. And then you'll notice in some of the quotes that are shared in here that the hills were often referred to as mountains in these historic accounts. So the hills was like Austin. They would refer to Austin as the hill city, but then, you know, what we refer to as the hill country out west, those were mountains back in the day. So we'll begin our first time period and timeline of events. And while I've been unable to find any written accounts for Central Texas prior to 1700, several significant events occurred that will influence events in the next century. So Cabeza de Vaca, shipwrecked off the coast of Galveston, began the first European exploration of interior Texas. And then the map on the slide shows the approximate route that he traveled through South Texas and then on into Mexico. And with the arrival of the Europeans, we have the introduction of livestock, followed by acquisition of the horse by Native Americans. And then our next timeline of events, 1700 to 1800. So following acquisition of the horse, the Comanches moved south into Texas and displaced many of the neighboring tribes, including those formerly in the Texas Hill Country. And while the Comanches were expanding southward, the Spanish were moving to the north and east and at least trying to establish a network of missions and presidios. So all of the written accounts during this time period, this 1800 time period, are associated with the Spanish expeditions. And I have a couple of examples. And a little bit of background before we talk about the quote or read the quote. So these early Spanish expeditions avoided the Hill Country and just kind of skirted the edge. The major highway, if you want to call it that, was during this time was a route between San Antonio and Nacogdoches and was known as the Camino Real or Old San Antonio Road, and roughly followed what's today Highway 21. So this is the first account I could find of travel that actually went into the Hill Country beyond the Balcones Escarpment. The map shows the route for the entire expedition from the Rio Grande up through Nacogdoches, and those are the red lines. And then the locations of present-day cities are shown as stars for reference. So again, San Antonio, New Braunfels, San Marcos, Austin, and then Nacogdoches off to the east. And then this particular account is near present-day New Braunfels, and the expedition is traveling up the Guadalupe River. And I'll point out here also that all of the accounts of the Hill Country vegetation are presented in italics throughout this presentation. So this observer also refers to traveling a distance of 3 leagues, which is roughly 8 miles. And I can't see all of my slide, but let's see. I think I remember it well enough. So the quote, this is Father Celis in 1719. And he says, we traveled upstream with a desire to ford the Guadalupe River or reach its source. We traveled about 3 leagues or 8 miles of very rugged land owing to the heavy woods and many rocks. At the end of the 3 leagues, 2 soldiers left for upstream to reconnoiter the land. They said that it could not be traveled because it is more wooded and contains more rocks. The woods consist of oaks and junipers. So the second account is the first recorded European foray across the Hill Country. The observer traveled as part of an expedition from San Antonio north toward the San Saba region to establish a mission and a presidio. And this is De Miranda in 1756. And he says that going past the Balcones Escarpment, we arrived at the river they call Balcones, which is the Guadalupe River. This travel was an effort because of the many hills and rocks, the many arroyos formed by the hills, and some thickets that contain valuable cedar and oak timbers. And other accounts of vegetation along this route, which included the Blanco and Pedernales rivers, had similar reports. And another quote is from the same expedition is, quote, in all of this region, which was between the Guadalupe River and the Blanco River, there are no commodities nor anything except good cedar and oak timber. And another quote, crossing many swollen creeks and thickets of cedar and oak timber, we arrived at the Arroyo de los Pedernales, so the Pedernales River. So this is our third time period, 1800, 1850. Lots of changes happening during the 1800s. So I divided the century in half. So we begin the 1800s with 2 wars. We have Mexico's War of Independence from Spain, followed by Texas War of Independence from Mexico. Houston and Lamar battled over the location of the Texas Capitol, and Lamar finally won. And we end the time period with Texas becoming part of the United States. So the following excerpts are examples of written accounts during this time period. And then just something I want to point out on this slide as well is just note Lamar's first formal address to the Texas Congress in 1839. I was actually kind of shocked when I was researching this to see this. But you just think about, you know, whether this might have affected how well we understood the Native American cultures during this time period. So this first account provides a good example of an observer reporting grass as far as the eye can see. So it's critical to note that the observer was describing the Blackland Prairie, and we need to keep reading for his description of the hill country. The map again, the route is shown as a red line. The approximate location of the observer and his direction, I don't know how well you can see that, but it's a little black dot. It's actually an arrow. So he's on the Post Oak Savanna, just about to enter the Blackland Prairie, and he can see the Edgeworth Plateau in the background. So we'll read Mr. Benedict from 1839, who said, immediately before us appeared as an extensive lawn with a beautiful green sward, slightly tinged with the various flowers which decked its surface. Not a shrub or bush obstructed the monotony except for the towering live oak. And then again, you got to keep reading. Further to the west appeared the skirting timber, thickening the further it receded and rising gradually, so that mile after mile of the dark boating forest rose to our view, so that one's imagination or view would be extending to the intricacies of the forest in search for the curling smoke of the wigwam. Kind of an interesting way that they talked. And so here we have a few descriptions written by the founder of New Braunfels in 1845. This is a portrait of Prince Carl, and we'll read what he had to say back then. On the left bank of Comal Creek, there is well-forested bottomland which extends to the cedar, oak, and elm-covered cliffs, which here already have considerable height. Beyond this, there is a high ridge with summits here and there, similar to our Black Forest. From its confluence with the Comal Creek, I, with 4 companions, attempted to reach the head spring. However, having covered only 5 miles after hours of chopping through underbrush and heavy forest, we had to return without success. So he's talking about traveling long distances through underbrush and heavy forest that he compares to the Black Forest that he knew back home in Germany. Here are 2 more descriptions near New Braunfels. These are from Ferdinand Romer, who was a German geologist. He spent over a year studying the geology of Texas from 1845 to 1846 and wrote extensive accounts of his travels. And we'll read these. The cedars here are not the stunted shrub-like plants found in the northern states of the Union, but are stately trees with straight trunks, seldom more than 20 to 25 feet in height and 1.5 feet thick. They have a uniformly spreading crown. The cedar forest is a treasure to the colonists in New Braunfels, since the wood was preferred above all others on account of its durability when used in building houses and fences. So note the size of the juniper trees, 1.5 feet thick. Those are pretty good sized trees. And he refers to junipers as being stately trees, a treasure to the colonists, so kind of different than what we hear today. And in the photo, this is of an Ashe Juniper Tree that's in New Braunfels and is listed as the champion tree in the National Register of Big Trees. And it's reported as being 41 feet tall and 3.7 feet in diameter. So that's huge. We have a few big Ashe Juniper trees. I know Audubon does too on Baker Sanctuary within the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. Not quite as big as a champion, but like this is a pretty good sized tree. And these are really slow growing trees based on growth measurements on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve and the Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge data that we've compiled. Ashe juniper diameters grow about 1/2 inch to 1 inch per decade. So a 10-inch diameter tree would be around 100 to 200 years old, and then the champion tree would be around 440 to 880 years old. And we don't know that for sure, but yeah, I mean, they're definitely big old trees, or what I would call heritage trees. And then these observers describe the route between Austin and San Antonio, essentially along what is today the I-35 corridor. So again, traveling along the Blackland Prairie. And then the stars again are just show the major towns at the base of the escarpment. And then the escarpment itself is, instead of the black and white line, it's just kind of that red squiggly line. And just reading, let's see, yeah, we've got two accounts here from Romer and, no, Victor Brodt in 1849. And he says, the hills which extend all the way from Austin to New Braunfels are covered with heavy timber. And then Romer, same year, says, the road between New Braunfels and San Antonio led us over an open, undulating prairie of great fertility. A cedar-covered slope, similar to that in New Braunfels, was at our right for the first 10 miles, which farther on flattened out into a low-lying chain of hills. And during the mid-1800s, other sources of information become available, including original land grants. And this slide shows the original land grants for Travis County. They're outlined in gray, and they're overlaid on the major ecological regions. So again, the Blackland Prairie is the dark green, and the Edwards Plateau is the lighter green to the west. Field survey notes were usually recorded along with the original land grants and often provide information on the species of trees and sometimes even their diameters, and we refer to these as witness trees. So this information can provide insight as to what the dominant trees were at the time that the notes were written. This is actually a photograph of field survey notes for William Barton's property near Barton Springs in 1838. And they didn't, the notes don't talk about the diameters, but they do mention the species, and they include an elm, a hackberry, 5 cedars, a Spanish oak, and a live oak. So definitely some woodlands there. So this is the last time period, 1850 to 1900, with the advent of the industrial age in Texas. So we begin this time period with moving Native Americans onto reservations, which were then moved from Texas to Oklahoma. And thinking again about that mural that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, where area Indians were conducting annual burns in 1865, and there were only a few remnant bands really left at this time. And I just have to say, I haven't been able to find any evidence of that yet. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if anybody does happen to have that, let me know. But yeah, so continuing on, barbed wire was patented in 1868. Pretty dramatic changes happening to our landscape, along with the first train arriving in Austin in 1871. We have the establishment of national parks, the opening of colleges, the completion of the Texas State Capitol, and the discovery of oil in Texas. Major cattle drives started up with an estimated 20 million cattle driven from Texas to Kansas between 1866 and 1886. And the sheep and goat industry also started up around the same time. The first US Census was taken in 1850 when the population in Texas was reported as a little over 200,000. And by 1900, the Texas population was over 3 million. So an increase of over 14 times during that 50-year period. And the largest increase occurred after 1870, so just a little bit after the Civil War ended. And by the end of the century, we'd lost 2 of the most abundant species ever reported on this continent, the passenger pigeon and the American bison. So the following excerpts are examples of written accounts from the 1850 to 1900 time period. So according to this observer, Ashe Juniper was being cut for rail timber as far back as 1855. And remember, the first train arrived in Austin in 1871, so that lines up pretty well. Talking about the map a little bit for orientation. So the route is shown as a red line. The location of this particular account is the red circle, and he's in what is today Williamson County. We'll read Mr. Johnson from 1855, and he says, we rode from Austin to the Brushy Creek, 20 miles near Cedar Park. And I can't see, and encamped for the night. Our road was for about 14 miles of the way over a rich rolling prairie and for about 6 miles through a heavy cedar brake. Cedar is the main reliance for rail timber in this section, the live oak being too gnarled for such purposes. So just note again the reference to 6 miles of heavy cedar brake and then the contrast between his description of the hill country and the prairie. And then by the late 1880s, we now have maps and photos that we can then use to corroborate the written accounts. This is a map of Austin. I forgot the date, but it's like late 1880s. And if you note here, so remember Austin was settled on the Blackland Prairie side, and the artist rendition of grass is flat versus the woodland, which is textured on the map. And then here's a photo that was taken from the Capitol Dome shortly after completion of the construction, and it's looking southwest. So you can kind of compare those and make sure that they're lining up okay, and then read the accounts and make sure that all of this is kind of fitting together and making sense. So we have Victor Brockton, 1849, saying, I have visited Austin for the first time. The surrounding country is quite beautiful. Dark, steep, cedar-covered mountains rise from about 5 miles north of the city. The country on Barton Creek presents this is De Cordova in 1858. The country on Barton Creek presents an extensive range of cedar hills and is much broken. So now we come to the descriptions from Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted was a travel writer, landscape architect, and designed urban parks, including Central Park in New York City. And this is a photo of San Marcos in 1890. And we'll read what he says. Beyond San Marcos, our road approached closely the hill range, which is made up of spurs coming down from mountains north. They are well wooded with cedar and live oak. Behind us were the continuous wooded heights with a thick screen of cedars, before us very beautiful prairies. So compare these descriptions with Olmsted's accounts, from Olmsted's accounts with those in the article discussed at the beginning of this presentation that concluded the hill country was predominantly grassland and juniper is invasive, or at least forest woodlands are invasive. And his account actually describes the hills as being well wooded with a thick screen of cedars. But when he describes the prairie side, it is consistent with that, the account in that article. And then you also want to line up, his account with the photo. And yeah. So it's very similar to what we see today. Here we combine information from the original land grants and historic accounts. And note here that the plot sizes are large on the prairie. So again, the dark green compared to those on the Edgeworth Plateau, the light green. And I don't know if you can see my cursor okay, but yeah, when I first looked at this, I remember asking, I was like, why are these plots so big? And these are little bitty, especially as you go along the Colorado River. And then the descriptions from these observers provide a possible explanation. So we'll read De Cordova from 1858. Wildlands in Travis County may be purchased at very low rates. The cost of improvements is a serious item, but when a cedar fence is once put around a plantation, it will need but little repair for many years. With vast prairies, we also have cedar lands at intervals seldom exceeding 5 miles, and these can be purchased at a small price. The planter finds a cedar lot of indispensable value from the abundant material for improvements with which it furnishes him. And then Mr. Wood in 1861 says, our fences are chiefly made of cedar rails from the cedar break above Austin. So this is a photo of Bull Creek. It's just a little bit north of the confluence with the Colorado River or Lake Austin. And I paired it with this quote, which says, it's De Cordova in 1858, and it says, the mountains are covered with cedar and send clear crystal waters gushing from them. So based on the historic accounts, water was abundant along the base of the Balcones Escarpment. And this is the reason why, you have the town springing up right there, because they had, the big springs, that supported the population, the human population. And this account is just one of many examples that describes abundant water supplies that are associated with a forested hill country. And here we have an observer expressing concern about overgrazing by sheep as far back as 1860. And I paired this photo with the quote, since it looks, I'm going to use my cursor again, it looks kind of overgrazed there. And then the trees don't look super healthy. This is my all-time favorite photo. It took me a long time to figure out where exactly this was taken. But this dirt road right here is what is today RM 2222. Bull Creek is in the background. If anybody's eaten at the County Line restaurant or seen it, it would be like right over here. And then there's a fire station over here. Lakewood Drive would be over there. Loop 360 would be in the background. It looks pretty different today, which is, I think, why it's so hard to tell that that's where it was. And then the cabin, if you look close, is made out of juniper logs. It doesn't look like it's in super good shape. When I looked at the like the 1940 aerial photo of this area, which is as far back as you can go, you don't see any signs of this little cabin. So I think it got probably taken down a long time ago. But we do have you know, some cabins and like old cabins and barns that's on and near the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve that were made. So again, you're looking at building materials made from large juniper logs during the latter part of the 1800s. The livestock industry expanded on the Edwards Plateau during the 1900s. The map on the slide shows just how concentrated the sheep and goat industry has been on the plateau. And I've lived in Texas almost all my life, and I actually didn't know this either until I put this presentation together. And the photo is of an Angora goat herd on what is today part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. So just kind of thinking about how this might have affected or changed the vegetation over time. And I'm going to pair a couple of my other favorite quotes in a photo. The quote is from the Austin Daily Democratic Statesman, which was the precursor to today's Austin American Statesman. And in the photo, you'll note these are juniper railroad ties, and this is what was used to build the railroad. And yeah, so let's read this one from 1874. The cedar tie business has contributed largely to the growth and prosperity of the Hill City. So again, that's Austin. In the last 2 years, more especially the last 12 months. A gentleman connected with the Central Railroad says that, and I'm going to emphasize this, 200,000 cedar ties have been shipped from the city during the last 2 years. So between 1872 and 1874, 200,000 cedar ties being shipped from Austin. And when it's remembered that these ties bring from 60 to 90 cents each, the reader will readily comprehend the vastness of the revenue from this source. So this is an account from Henry Atwater expressing concern about habitat for the golden-cheeked warbler as far back as 1892. Atwater was a naturalist and ornithologist, among other things. He became the agricultural and industrial agent for the Southern Pacific Railroad, and for my Audubon folks, he was the director of the National Audubon Society. And we'll read his quote from 1892. He says, golden-cheeked warblers are nowhere abundant and only to be met within the thickest cedar breaks. And as these are fast being cut and burned out, the bird will no doubt become still more rare. And then just note the photo of the golden-cheeked warbler nest made of Ashe Juniper bark. And in an Ashe Juniper, this was taken by my friend Gil Eckrich, who used to work at Fort Hood. And just the fact that we have this species that evolved to depend on Ashe Juniper is just another example that it's a native tree. And I know I don't need to tell you guys that, but I hear it a lot. It's not native. So my project ends with William Bray's publications in 1904. William Bray was a botany professor at the University of Texas at Austin and wrote a lengthy report about the timber of the Edwards Plateau and another report that same year about the forest resources of Texas. And as you read through these reports, you can tell he's kind of trying to strike this balance between what he probably was perceiving as exploitation and conservation. And so this is where we start to see a shift in perspective about the hill country vegetation, with later reports describing the hill country as grassland being invaded by woodlands. We get a hint of this from Bray's reports, but not as full-blown as what we see in later years and today. And we'll read this quote, again, 1904, William Bray. The writer knows of no region in which any species of cedar is so uniformly abundant and dominant as is the mountain cedar in the limestone country of Texas. Mountain cedar is the most valuable tree of the semi-arid hill country of Texas. And another excerpt from William Bray attempts to describe the extent of the woodlands, and I'll just read this quote. The data are not at hand to warrant even an approximate estimate of the area covered by cedar. The Colorado River breaks, one of the largest series, are almost continuous from Austin to the San Saba country. It is perhaps no exaggeration to estimate the area of these alone at 500 square miles. And that Colorado River break series from Austin to San Saba, that would include the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, include the Audubon Sanctuary, and then also the Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge. So how did our perceptions change from stately trees, treasured cedar forest, valuable tree to where we are today, and why? I've really been interested in this as well. So we'll start by taking a look at land uses beginning at the latter part of the 1800s. Cedar, or Ashe juniper, was so abundant that it supported a whole culture of people dedicated to harvesting it. It was first used to make charcoal, people were referred to as charcoal burners, and later for fence posts, railroad ties, telegraph poles, logs for buildings, all types of building materials. Cedar clearing was such a big industry that an axe was created specifically for this purpose. And this is a great article by Gene Holland from 1946, and we'll read this quote. He says the cedar eradication program was greatly accelerated as a result of the invention of a new type of axe, and they called it the cedar axe, especially suited for cutting cedar trees and cedar brush. The cedar axe is a product of the hill country in Texas, where armies of cedar choppers have been swinging away for over 30 years. It was invented partly by accident and partly because of a real need for a better tool to do the job. So he's talking armies of cedar choppers for a long time, 30 years. The size and intensity of fires appeared to increase during the mid to late 1800s as well. Here's just one example. Again, this is William Bray in 1904, talking about a fire of about 600 acres was his estimate near Marble Falls in 1901. And we're not going to read this quote, but I just put this in just to say it wasn't just juniper that was being cleared. Lots of other trees were being harvested. So this is just one example, and he's referring to the mountain Spanish oak, which we would call Texas red oak today. Oaks were used for firewood, just like today. Cherry trees were used by Texas pioneers for furniture. Bald cypress was harvested for a wide variety of wood products. So now let's look at how land use history has influenced what we see today. And we refer to these influences as legacy effects. And we'll use William Bray's accounts of the West Bank Peninsula in 1904. So I'm going to show you 3 photographs from William Bray's Timber of the Edwards Plateau report, but first provide orientation for the location of the photos. So this slide shows a topo map of the West Bank Peninsula just west of Austin, and the date of the map is about 1895. And again, just for reference, I've got Austin on here in the lower right. We have Lake Austin, which you see in blue. And back then it was called Lake McDonald. We have Mount Bunnell over here, Bull Creek, where I had a picture earlier with that bend in the creek, because it's roughly right there. Loop 360 would kind of be going up just west of what's today Wild Basin Vireo Preserve, part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, just west of Lone Tree Hill. And then Pennybacker Bridge would be somewhere right about here. So the first photo that I'll show you, William Bray took standing on the top of Lone Tree Hill, just here, and he's facing north and into what he's calling the North Gorge, which is like right here, if you can see my cursor. And then the second photo is from south of Lone Tree Hill. So I'm not sure exactly where he's standing, but probably somewhere right about here. And he's looking north into what he calls the South Gorge, which would be right here, with Lone Tree Hill in the background. And so he's comparing and contrasting these drainages that are, or these ravines that are on either side of both north and south of Lone Tree Hill. Let's see, I already mentioned that, yeah, this is just north of what's today part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, Wild Basin, and Vireo Preserve tracts. The third photo that I'll show you was taken along Dry Creek on the other side of the river over here. And this is near or on what is today the Brightleaf Preserve, which is now also part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. All right, so here's the first photo. This is William Bray's photo of the North Gorge. So again, he's standing on top of Lone Tree Hill facing north. And he's describing this view as an almost impenetrable growth of cedar and mixed timber. So we're basically looking at old growth or virgin forest. And then here is William Bray's photo of the South Gorge, which he describes as having been cleared of most of the woody vegetation. And to illustrate the effects of forests on soils and the behavior of rainfall and runoff, William Bray compared these two areas. He describes the heavily timbered Northern Gorge as having a deep layer of rich soil. And then in contrast, the Southern Gorge had been, quote, denuded of soil down to the rock and adobe and are never covered with more than a scanty growth of drought-enduring plants, which do not suffice to hide the white arid slopes. And then during a heavy rainfall, water in the Southern Gorge would, quote, pour down as from a steep roof and erode every vestige of organic soil. Bray describes the runoff after heavy rainfall as being very violent in the Southern Gorge. Again, in contrast, in this forested Northern Gorge, he says, quote, the downpour broken by the timber covering is shorn of its force and is largely taken up by the porous ground. Thus, the water is prevented from getting head enough to form a flood or to erode the soil, and at the same time is detained so that vastly greater quantities are absorbed by the limestone formation beneath. And then in his comparison of these two photos, Bray is making several points: that forests build soil, that forests protect soil from erosion, keeping it cool and moist, and that forests act as a sponge and promote recharge. And Bray concludes that for all these reasons, forests tend to conserve the water supply and maintain full springs and an even flow of streams. Bray believed that the woodlands of the Edwards Plateau were critical to protecting water supplies downstream, like all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and advocated for their protection. A couple of other quotes. He said, quote, both the welfare of the Edwards Plateau itself and the welfare of the coast plain adjacent to it strongly demand the retention of a permanent timber covering on the plateau. And another quote, that since the country is primarily a cattle country, the cattlemen are apt to regard the timber as a nuisance rather than a benefit. And then for that reason, he recommended that the state of Texas purchase and reserve large tracts of timber on the Edwards Plateau. So again, a real different perspective than what we have today. And then also just thinking about it, as the landscapes change, how do our perceptions of the hill country vegetation change over time? So had Bray's vision been fulfilled, and then we had actually been able to purchase large tracts for water quality and quantity downstream, this is what we would expect. We'd just go, oh, yeah, the forest of the Edwards Plateau. But if this is what we grew up with, and this is what we come to know as normal, this becomes our frame of reference. And so that's also going to shift our perspectives over time. So here's a photo of the Vireo Preserve and Wild Basin today, which is just south of the Lone Tree Hill area. And this shows just an example of what Bray was talking about: eroded slopes with sparse vegetation over subsoil. And we've lost a lot of the topsoil on these slopes. And without the benefit of Bray's descriptions and photos, we might just think, well, this is the way it's always looked. This is the natural phenomenon. And I've given this presentation several times and talked about these different photos, but even with that historical evidence, I've still been asked, whether these clearings, whether these slopes are natural, whether they happen that way naturally. So I'm like, okay, well, now we'll take a walk and look for evidence of past events on the landscape. And this is what we call reading the landscape. So fortunately, Ashe Juniper makes this job pretty easy. The wood breaks down slowly. So where it's been left in place, it can last a really long time. And these are just a couple of photos of many juniper stumps that you can see on these mostly bare slopes. And because the slopes are steep, the soil washes off really quickly, and it's very hard for the plants to get reestablished. You can see when you look at these stumps, you can see signs of hatchet marks. You can see it on all of them. And then there's a burn scar over here. And we call these old stumps ghost trees. And in this case, we're kind of looking at a ghost forest. Unfortunately, we've lost evidence of the hardwoods and other plants that would have been part of the forest, since these break down really quickly compared to Ashe Juniper. But we know that they were there. We just don't know exactly what. It would have been fun to see it though. So this is the third photo of William Bray's that I mentioned. This is the one that's on Dry Creek that's either on or near what's today the Brightly Preserve. And we'll read this one too. So again, 1904. Near Austin, cedar breaks that were cut close to 25 years ago, about 1875, are now being cut a second time. During the past 2 or 3 years, a tract on Dry Creek has again been cut with a large yield of fuel timber. This photo shows the condition of the cedar break after 25 years of growth. Of course, there was very little, if any, tie or post timber in this and no clear heart cedar. So I think several things to note here is one, just again, how far back the clearing was. So we had second growth being cut in 1875. And the other thing I'll point out is, like we talked about, the diameter growth rates being about 1/2 inch to 1 inch per decade. And if you look at, if he's saying it's 25 years of growth, and I don't know exactly what the diameter on those are, but it looks to me like it's around 3 inches. So that would be fairly consistent with what we found as well. And then he's also just making this point that being a slow growing tree, stands of young juniper at this point have little economic value except for fuel. So while cutting old growth juniper was profitable, younger growth has little commercial value and is, as Bryce said, considered a nuisance. And then you've got steel increasingly being used for fence posts. You've got oil for fuel, so you don't really need the juniper anymore. And then as a result, the federal government began to subsidize clearing for agriculture. And this is another quote from Gene Holland in 1946. And he says, about the time of World War I, the need for more land for farming and ranching became acute. So much so that the farmers and ranchers began a systematic eradication of the cedar. During the next 20 years in Texas alone, more than 1 million acres of brushland was cleared of cedar and thus became more valuable for farming and ranching purposes. In 1937, this pasture improvement project was included as a ranch conservation practice in the AAA, or Agricultural Administration Act program. And since that time, almost, I'll just say over 3 million acres of cedar trees and brush in Texas have been cleared. It's estimated that the AAA has paid out approximately $4 million for the carrying out of this practice during the program years 1937 to 1944. So now by the mid 20th century, we've gone from stately tree or valued tree to the lowly tree. And I was going to point out on this, yeah, they've got like a cedar yard here. And this is a photo that I took just outside of Kerrville, actually right near where that mural was taken that I talked about at the beginning. So there are a few cedar yards left in Texas, but this particular article talks about cedar posts being shipped as far north as Nebraska, which is interesting. I didn't realize that they went out of Texas, but apparently there was a demand. So I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to pose a question and a call for action. So this is my appeal. And the question is can we reverse or at least improve public opinion of the juniper tree? I have a title on here, or a headline of an article that was published in 2012, along with a graphic in that same article showing a bullseye on Ashe juniper, referring to juniper as Texas' most hated tree. So it's just one of many examples of how maligned this tree has become. And so another question is, how do we protect species like the golden-cheeked warbler when the tree it depends on is not valued? Not to mention all of the other species that depend on juniper or at least benefit from it. And my hope is that given that Ashe juniper was once considered a valuable asset and commodity, at least, I don't know if reversing public opinion is possible, but at least we might be able to improve it a little bit. We've seen successful PR campaigns for other maligned species like bats, which are now a major tourist attraction in Austin, thanks to groups like Bat Conservation International. And other examples of campaigns that have helped raise public awareness. Nicole mentioned the Lights Out for migrating birds. And I think Travis Audubon's just done an amazing job along with others to help raise awareness of that issue. The Dark Sky Initiative is another one. So, I guess with the golden-cheeked warbler's dependence on the juniper tree and how unique and special these forests are, this is our legacy and heritage. And I guess I'm just hoping, that there might be some interest in helping to improve opinion of this tree and our forests. So this is our little part. We recently made a video of one of our neighbors. This is Don Gardner talking about Ashe junipers on the ranch that his family's owned for over 40 years. And here he's explaining how the needle cast of the juniper tree is building soil, how that helps and allows other plants to germinate and grow. And those plants then also, then contribute to the soil building process. And the video is just a little over 3 minutes long. It's received over 18,000 views since we posted it online in August of 2020. So yeah, anytime you put cedar in the headline, it seems to generate a lot of interest. I think it's going to get posted in the chat. So what I presented is just an abbreviated version of a slightly larger body of work. So if anybody's interested or just needs it as a resource, this is the bigger report. It actually follows pretty closely the PowerPoint. Actually, I used the PowerPoint presentation to create the report and then just kind of expanded it. And then all of the citations and the quotes and all are in the back and an appendix as well. I also have a Juniper reference document that I made that it wasn't really meant to be a standalone document. It was just to serve as a resource, just to help dispel some of the misinformation, and it provides lots of citations and lots of quotes. And so, yeah, again, it was meant to be, a resource for public outreach folks to use to make public outreach products. If you haven't heard of it already, I'm sure most people have. Elizabeth McGreevy has also written a book in this last year. Almost 600 pages trying to dispel all the negative misinformation about this tree. The title's Wanted, Mountain Cedars Dead and Alive, Rethinking Juniper Trees Last Seen Spreading Across the Texas Hill Country. So a very impressive body of work, and she's got lots of historical information in there as well. Just ending with just some kind of fun, nerdy trivia. Juniper actually wasn't formally described until 1930. I had somebody ask me during one of my talks, he said, well, but Romer talks about the eastern red cedar and Virginia, Juniperus virginiana. And I was like, yeah, but that was in the 1800s and this thing hadn't been described until 1930. So it got described really late. But it was named after this guy. And that's another question I've gotten asked is like, was it Ashe because the color of the bark is ashy? And it's like, no, it was named after William Willard Ashe. And he actually first collected it from Arkansas and noted difference from other juniper species. So John Buchholz, when he published the description, named it in honor of him for his collections. And I'm going to end with just one of my favorite pictures of a golden-cheeked warbler taking a bath. And again, this is our friend Gil Eckerich. Just takes these amazing photos of birds, especially warblers. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was excellent. And, I've seen bits and pieces of this over the years, and there's always some new little tidbit that pops out to me on it. So always learn something new. I think we do have a few questions. One person commented that their hope was that you would turn the study into a book that might help change attitudes, but we did have the link to the report in the chat. So that report is publicly available. And Lisa also mentioned the book by Elizabeth McGreevy too. So there is some material out there in defense of Ashe juniper. Another question that came up, and we've heard this one before, about juniper's use of water, and is it a water hog? And if you could make any comments on that.
Gosh, so my supervisor now is a hydrogeologist, Nico Howard, and he's the program manager for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve for the city of Austin side. And it's been really nice to team up with him because we can combine that biology and hydrogeology. And what Nico's found with some of his research is that juniper uses a lot of water during some times of the year, which is when we wanted to use water, when it's because we're very prone to flash flooding. And so it tends to use up water then. And then the stomata tend to be more open and it's releasing stuff back into the atmosphere. And then during really dry periods, it tends to shut down. I'd have to have him talk about his research on that. But yeah, and then I think also just, but that's one of the things that Nico has said, is that it's using water when you want it to. Other things on just water use is just thinking more holistically. And then again, Elizabeth McGreevy provides like a whole chapter on this, that it depends on where the trees are. Is it in a forest? How big is the tree? But yeah, it doesn't, you know, the best information that we have so far is it doesn't seem to use more than any other native tree. But I think the important role is that, again, with that evergreen vegetation, is that it's slowing that water down, because again, we've got that flash flooding. So you don't want like just water just pounding and like hitting the ground, because then it all runs off and then you've just got runoff and you get flooding. So what you want is just for it to very slowly come down, and you want good soil under there. That sponge is going to absorb it and then soak it into the ground. You also want big roots, you know, that help get that water down into the ground. There's at least 2 studies that I know of that talk about recharge actually being better under juniper canopy than in open areas. So lots of information out there. I think the juniper reference document I put together talks a little bit about that, but Elizabeth's book just goes into amazing detail on it.
So we had another question, just if you can maybe repeat or reiterate the role of Native Americans in burning the hill country.
Yeah, so I've not found anything yet. So it may be that they burned in some areas, but I haven't found anything that they burned in the forested areas on the eastern Edgeworth Plateau. I know that there were burned rock middens, and so they were cooking and doing things like that. But I haven't come across any information or any accounts that suggest that that they were doing the equivalent of a prescribed burn. Where I have seen fire is on the prairie side. Both the Native Americans and the Spaniards would use fire as for smoke signals. So it was a way to communicate. They would, like the Spanish expeditions would talk about, you know, that they would stop for the night, they would light a fire, they would have the, you know, do the smoke signals and then bring in Native Americans to help them navigate, basically, or communicate with them in some way. I read an account again on the prairie side where I guess the Spaniards, I think it was Spaniards, came into one of the Native American settlements, and the Native Americans lit a fire basically as a smoke screen so that they could get away, and they basically abandoned you know, their village. And then the only other one that I've read was, again, it was not like a firsthand account, but it was way in West Texas where there was a guy who was talking about that this area, there was like a little patch, and it wasn't like a big area, but there was a little patch of grass that had been burned. And he was saying the Native Americans had burned it for the buffalo, so basically to provide graze for buffalo. But it was pretty far west. And I think one of the important things is, you know, what somebody may have been doing in one area may not have necessarily extrapolated over to another. So yeah, it seems like it would have been pretty risky to just be lighting fires in the forest. But I don't know, that's kind of my thought. But yeah, so I have not found anything to support that at this point.
So another question, are you aware of any remnant old growth Ashe juniper forest? I guess ones that haven't, you know, that are virgin, haven't been cut, and, you know, they mentioned like, do something like that maybe occur at, like over like at Lost Maples or some other protected area? Does any of that exist at all?
Yeah, I've asked that question before. We have remnant trees I don't know how many places have not been cut over to some extent. Even places where I've had people tell me that, yeah, this is virgin, never been cut. I'm like, well, there's a stump there and there's another stump there. So I think we have places with less disturbance. But man, if there is a true old growth, yeah, we need to find it, protect it for sure. And I would love to see it, but I personally haven't seen it. But we do have, again, and I think the reason that we have golden-cheeked warblers is because we do have so many old trees left, both oaks and junipers.
So another question here is, can you tell us about any successes in restoring some of these lost forests?
Well, we're trying. So one of the things we're doing on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve is we're taking the more degraded spots where, so we use a lot of aerial photography, and we go back to 1940 and look every year and see, okay, where are the areas that it just looks like the areas near Lone Tree Hill that I was describing, where if you go all the way back to 1940, it's been bare, just caliche, and those are the areas we really focus on, and we try to work with nature. And so just sort of filling in something to where the forest eventually can kind of take over. So like if the water's just pouring off down a slope, can we slow it down? Can we have some erosion control? It's going to be a really long process though. I mean, that's part of the thing I keep telling people is protect your forest, because it takes a really long time to get it back. They grow so slow. But yeah, but we're trying to essentially fill in and reduce that fragmentation. We also do what we call hyperlocal, where we collect native seeds, the ones that need to be prepped. Some things need to go through an animal gut, so sulfuric acid, which I don't want to do, but I send it off to somebody who's willing to do it for us, and they'll treat the seeds, and then we spread that out again under canopy. We've done lots of experiments planting acorns, and found that if you don't plant them under canopy, then they essentially fry. We just have really hot, intense summers, so they have to be under some sort of canopy, or August, you just lose them all. So we're trying to restore native plant diversity under the forest that we have, because we have had a lot of, whether it's cutting or grazing or whatever, we've lost a lot of that diversity. So we try to bring it back and try to use as much local native seed as we can. I feel like I'm rambling. Did I answer that question? I hope.
All right, while we're waiting to see if I guess there's any further questions. This is, I guess, a question from me. I'm just curious, this research seems pretty compelling to me, that these oak juniper woodlands, these ash junipers native, there is dense cedar breaks. I'm just kind of curious, when you present that argument to people, is it, are people starting to acknowledge that, the kind of the opponents of it, or are they still kind of deny that, kind of the historical reality of, kind of what went down?
So I have kind of all of the above. So I have some people that are like, oh, that's pretty cool. I have other people though that really get entrenched, and it kind of seems like their strategy is just to ignore and just to continue with what they've always said, that it was prairie or savanna, and this is the way they're going to manage. And yeah, they don't really care. So there's just some people that you can't reach, and I don't particularly worry about that. I'm always interested to know, do they have other information that might be different, that might support that? I certainly don't know everything. So, always looking for new information. But yeah, it really is kind of like, I get the full spectrum of people who either think it's really interesting information, or people who just, it doesn't matter what you're going to tell them.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That was excellent information as usual. And I think I'm going to pass it off back to Nicole.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. The chat is full of Congratulations and thanks. You did a wonderful job. We thank everybody for joining us tonight. We hope we will see you at our next member meeting and speaker series on April 21st. So have a good evening. Take care. We'll see you next
Thanks
time.
so much.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you, Lisa. Take care. Bye-bye.